he was shot dead by a sniper in a tree. But the troops had seen him go, and they all surged forward together, and finally we managed to get to the small crossroads halfway up the hill.
The capture of the crossroads at La Verinière turned the tide. The 5th Wiltshire had gained their objective at a terrible cost. The commanding officer was dead, the second-in-command was captured, and at one time the battalion was commanded by the adjutant, and the battalion's strength was down to 60 men. But the tide had been turned.
It was a sweltering hot day, and we were pinned down all day, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon we saw a Churchill tank appear on the top of the rise.
What had happened was one of the small miracles of battle. 2 troops of the 13th, 18th Hussars had burst out of the La Verinière position, found an undefended track running uphill, and had gone flat out for the crest. 6 tanks made it. They sent back a message. We're all right, but rather lonely.
I felt, and the senior company commander felt, that probably we had broken the worst of the resistance. And so we called brigade headquarters and suggested another battalion should be sent through us while we held the vital crossroads. It was decided to do this, and the 4th Wiltshire were chosen.
During the battle, the 4th Wiltshire had marched all day into reserve. They had only just completed their move when orders came through to Lieutenant Colonel Luce to reach the top of the hill any way he liked. The battalion retraced its steps.
Colonel Luce took me as his gunner with him when he did his reconnaissance, and we walked through the 5th Wiltshire position on up the hill for about a quarter of a mile. It wasn't easy to see very much because it was closely wooded, and I must admit that I wasn't completely aware of the fact that there were so many Germans about. The colonel proceeded to give his orders for a silent attack to the top of the hill as light was falling. And in the middle of his orders, he suddenly stopped, turned to a hole in the ground of 2 or 3 yards away and said, "Come out of there, you so-and-sos," and there emerged a couple of armed Germans.
Meanwhile, the 4th Somerset Light Infantry, who had first seen the Hussars on top of the mountain, took action of their own accord.
My commanding officer then, Lieutenant Colonel C.T. Lipscomb, sent the forward company to liaise with this tank. And during the evening to me, he said, "Well, come along, Hunt," he said, "leave your brain gun," he said, "fix your bayonets," he said, "we'll go up forward and see if we can contact the forward company," which we did. And eventually we got right to the top of Mount Pincon without seeing anybody. So I said to the colonel, I said, "I think we come too far, sir, don't you?" And he said to me in his typical voice, "Oh yes, I think we have, Hunt," he said, "we better go back." And back we went, and we got back about 500 yards, and we were challenged, "Halt, who goes there?" I said, "Corporal Hunt, commanding officer." And then Major Hutchinson's voice piped up, "Is that you, sir?" And the colonel said, "Oh, yes, it's all right, Mike," he said. "Hunt and I have been to the top. You can carry on, go right through."
The 2 battalions, 4th Wiltshire and 4th Somerset, reached the summit within minutes of each other, each unaware that the other was there.
The companies were set off on this silent attack to the top of the hill in the dark. Colonel Luce led the remaining wheeled party by a different route, and we reached the top, where we were in complete darkness now, and we were very much mixed up with the infantry. But it was quite a brilliant method of getting there. Had we put down a heavy barrage, we should have warned the Germans, and this silent approach was very successful. But the 4th Battalion of the Wiltshire Regiment was very, very tired battalion when it reached there.
Throughout the night, the situation was, in the army slang of the day, a snafu. On top of Mont Pinson, in thick mist, 2 battalions and a squadron of tanks shared the hill with 500 Germans, each ignorant of the other's whereabouts. Still in their shirt sleeves, the troops were now frozen in the cold, damp fog. On the lower slopes, the enemy continued to fight it out, confusedly but viciously.
Everybody was absolutely dog-tired, and the CO got me to come up the top to see him early in the morning, up 4 in the morning, up there, and he told me to go back to A echelon and get all the transport I could, because the town was so tired that they just couldn't move. They could fall down the hill, that's about all. I said, well, where do I go from here? It was so misty, I couldn't see anything. And the moon came out, and I always remember saying, keep to the right of the moon, Tom, you'll be all right. And I went down the hill. And there was a terrific battle going on with all the cooks and people who didn't expect to be so rudely awakened, putting up a marvellous fight. And the Germans had come down the hill through the woods, and they were really playing havoc. And Captain Webb was also as Lofty, was sort of about so high. You remember him, Lofty Webb?
Yeah.
He had an enormous tank. He was sitting up some enormous self-propelled gun, directing operations, and honestly, Rommel wasn't in it.
When daylight come and we could take stock, we found that we'd infiltrated right throughout a German battalion, and we were camped all around them. And they didn't hear us digging in, and we heard nothing of them, but we were there first thing in the morning. And then, of course, we got held up then by a very heavy hail fog in mist. It wasn't until about 10 o'clock in the morning, when the mist lifted, that we could make the further advance.
The further advance was against the straggling village of Plessis-Grimold, lying right under the southeastern slope of the mountain. The road junction in this village was vital to the advance of 7th Armoured Division, who should have captured it themselves. Brigade Commander and Colonel Taylor of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry decided to surprise the enemy. A noisy, faint attack was made from the west, while under cover of darkness, the bulk of the battalion moved on the village from the north.
The ruse was brilliantly successful. A company of the DCLI burst into Plessis-Grimold, blew up an ammunition trunk, knocked out a King Tiger tank, the first of these monsters to be destroyed in Germany, and rampaged through the village. Demoralized prisoners poured in, and at one time they outnumbered their captors.
We went over the top of Mount Pinside about 2 o'clock in the morning. All I remember about that was seeing a couple of hundred Germans with their hands in the air coming up over the ground, with one British soldier with his desk coming up to the side of him, all prisoners.
If you remember, down at the bottom of the village, the patrol got into a dugout one side of the road. When they woke up next morning and looked out, there's a patrol the other side of the road. Another fellow said, "I've hit it."
I was standing in the road, and I had one of my sickeners called Savage, again from St. Austell. He was up a tree, tying this line over the top of the road, and he said, "Don't look right away, but you've got 2 chaps wanting to give themselves up." And I turned around, there was these chaps fully armed, with Luger pistols, all kinds of things, just with their hands above their heads, and I said, "Right, up you go up the road." I couldn't be bothered at that time to take prisoners, and we directed them to the headquarters and hoped for the best. We were in our shirt sleeves and feeling right with the world. We looked up across the field, and there came our CO. As you may have learned, he's a massive man. Colonel Taylor then, he's now Brigadier Taylor. And he must have got about a 48-inch chest and weighed 17 stone for certain, and a man about 6'3" or 4", I should think. And to my 5 foot something, he always did appear a fine figure of a man. And he was so delighted with his action of the day before that he couldn't sort of help talking about it. And he said, "Hello, Turnouth." He said, "Wasn't that a grand show yesterday?" I said, "It most certainly was, sir." He said, "See, boy," he said, "I fooled them," he said. "I put the main force of the attack and all the noise, all the din I could put up down the straight road. And for his straight road, he demonstrated with his clenched right fist. And 'twas not more than an inch or so away from my face. And being a powerful man, I thought myself, I hope you don't get too excited and release this clenched fist in my face." He said, "You see, you there Turnouth," he said, "you're watching my right clenched fist," he said. "But it doesn't come from there," he said. "It is the left hook that would prove so successful." And we had all those so-and-sos back in the compound before breakfast the next day.
Whereas actually the whole thing was ready to open up for the 7th Armoured did to go through. And I had to go down with Nobby Yates. We had to go to the last house of the village and report back any shelling. And the condition of the road, we stopped there all night. Then we got a message first thing in the morning, about 7 o'clock, to say, "We turned to battalion headquarters, 7th Armoured decided not to move."
The storming of Montpassant by the Wessex Division on August Bank Holiday marked the beginning of the end in Normandy. Now the Wyvern had secured a hinge or pivot for a gigantic sweep south and east towards Paris and the Seine. From now on, every new village liberated by the division made escape for the German forces more difficult, their ruin more certain.
When we were attacking these various little places like this, we could never understand why we weren't allowed to go on. But General Horrocks, Corps Commander, one of his conferences, explained to us the reason for this. We were what he called squeezing the bag. He got the enemy in a big area, surrounded almost by our troops, and left one small gap, which is known as the Falaise Gap.
When it came to squeezing the bag, the 43rd Division were the foot of the sack. The German armies were now trapped between the Americans in the south and the British and Canadians to the north. The westward end would be closed once and for all if the 43rd Division could cross the Noireau River and occupy the heights between Condé and Berjou.
I never forget, as we passed along a little flat road before we climbed Noireau Heights, there was a dear old French couple there. They must have been bordering on 80, and they lived in a typical French cottage with a veranda to their upstairs rooms, and they were out there standing on this veranda, both of them, as I say, nearly 80, and they were a great company one for the other. They were so kind one to the other as I could see. And this gentleman, in his white waving hair, was pointing to his wife where the shells were dropping. And I thought how funny, right in the middle of a battlefield, and a furious do it was, that those pair should be there and getting some fun out of the whole business.
My corporal, Corporal Bob Kosh from Plimpton, had rather a very bad experience of having a wooden tip bullet, and of course this was in a very bad place in the bottom of his spine, and I think he still has pieces of wood taken out of him today.
One fellow had a lucky escape, going across that field. He was going up to his platoon position, and from enfilade fire from the enemy, he had both breast pockets of his tunic taken off as he went along.
The Berjou Heights were taken and held, and while the Wessex Division sat back for its first proper rest for 2 months, the slaughter in the Falaise pocket went on. In an area approximately 7 miles by 4 miles, over 20,000 prisoners were taken, and 344 tanks, 2,447 lorries, 252 guns were found abandoned. British, Canadians and Americans now raced for the Seine.
On the evening of 22nd August, Major General Thomas reported to 30 Corps HQ and received verbal orders from General Horrocks. The tasks of 43rd Division were: A, to force a crossing of the Seine at Vernon on or about 25th August. B, to cover the construction of one Class 9 and one Class 40 bridge. C, to form a bridgehead of sufficient depth to allow the passage through of the remainder of 30 Corps. And D, to ensure the protection of the left flank of the Corps between the rivers Eure and Seine.
This meant that Major General Thomas had just 2 days in which to move his division 90 miles across the axis of advance of an American corps, and then to plan and carry out the assault crossing of a river over 600 feet wide.
I remember moving up to Vernon on a Sunday. We moved that by truck to about 5 kilometers from Vernon. We debussed and we moved through Vernon, because I turned around to my mate and I said, this is a funny war, because sort of we were moving down into Vernon to make the crossing, and there was the French people who were sort of out on a Sunday afternoon walk.
We have been listening to the wireless, and we knew that you were coming, and we were excited. Some people was afraid too, but we were so happy that we want to see you. And when the first soldiers came, because the English came, the Americans stopped in 3 kilometers, the one I've seen before, and they go somewhere else. But in Vernon, the English come, and everybody was happy to have one English friend. I invited him to have lunch with him. And I remember that my father had hidden a barrel of cognac, a good one, in 1940 in the garden. I cannot explain. And we take it off, and we invited the soldiers to drink with us. Of course, they were very happy. And everybody was, I don't want to say in love, but presque, almost.
Indeed, the situation in Vernon was chaotic. Most of the citizens had acquired arms of some sort and were now promenading the streets in a highly dangerous state. An American colonel was personally firing a mortar across the river amid an admiring crowd. The resistance movement had seized the barracks and barricaded themselves inside. Children swarmed over the vehicles, clamoring, "Cigarette pour papa, chocolat pour moi." The mayor of Vernon invited the officers of the Fort Wilts to a civic banquet. The police hoisted the tricolour, the stars and stripes, and the Union Jack in defiance of all security. And it was virtually physically impossible to make a reconnaissance of the crossing sites.
Opposite Vernon is the garden suburb of Vernonette. The river at this point is 200 yards wide with a 3-knot current. The whole area is dominated by a high escarpment. It was planned to blanket the German positions on these hills with a smoke screen fired by the artillery.
We arrived short of the Seine sometime during the late afternoon. Our job was to put down a smoke screen so the bridge could be put across. I would think that we maintained a smoke screen on the Seine for about at least 4 hours. And anyone who's a gunner will know what that entailed. The artillery was called on 24 hours a day.
The railway bridge was completely destroyed. The nearby road bridge was thought to be possible for infantry. It was commanded by a German machine gun post. 4th Somerset Light Infantry were to cross off the left near the railway bridge, and 5th Wiltshire upstream, opposite the main escarpment.
Each battalion had a problem. First, at the Somerset's crossing, the map showed a channel between the riverbank and Vernonnet. Now, was this channel wet or dry? Well, the locals swore that it was dry, and since they lived there, we had to take their word for it. Secondly, opposite the Wiltshire site was a submerged mudbank. And again, the civilians were emphatic that this offered no hindrance to boats.
The crossing was to be covered by fire from the divisional mortars, machine guns, and supporting tanks.
Wonderful mortar position on the tarmac, which is the best thing you'd never find for firing mortars. And we were there, and then found my own observation post in the tower, where they hoisted flags for all nations. And I thought, well, this is the end of us, because with all these flags in the shortest spot. But they didn't. We fired away from there.
At 6:45 p.m., the guns opened fire, and the streets emptied as if by magic. At 7 o'clock, the first storm boats entered the water.
There was attached to 43 Divisional Headquarters at this time a unit of what was known as the J Service. This was 2 listening sets tuned to the wireless nets of the forward companies, one for the Somersets and one for the Wiltshires. On the Wilts set, we heard boats away, and then a long pause, and Christ, they've stuck. The first 2 boats had in fact grounded on a mud bank, and there were very few survivors. On the Somerset side, all seemed to be going smoothly. And then, at about 8 or 8:30, I think, a furious voice came on the air shouting, "I thought you said this bloody channel was dry. It's wet. Repeat, wet. Repeat, wet." And indeed, the 2 leading companies of the 4th Somersets were marooned on an island.
But despite all setbacks, the bridgehead was won. Under heavy shell and mortar fire, the engineers managed to raft over some armoured cars and even a few tanks, and they commenced work on the 2 vital pontoon bridges. Headed by the 1st Worcestershire, reinforcements crossed by the damaged road bridge, and gradually the bridgehead was extended into the wilderness of the Forêt de Vernon.
over a pontoon bridge there, turned left, and came up to a place called the Chateau of Prasangi, which was a home for children born out of wedlock between the German officers and the French women. And that was the first place we were able to take our clothes off, you know, sleep in sheets from the time we commenced operations. I know that the commanding officer said, well, now's the chance, get under sheets. And that was the night that we had a counterattack and the Jerry's entered town headquarters.
Yes. No time at all, we were in a fairly deep sleep. But a few hours later, there was an awful shoe muzzle. Bullets were flying about all over the place. There was a hang of a noise and hullabaloo.
And we were just shooting into this, you know, on our shorts and shirts and making a good thing of it.
I was just getting into bed when there was, oh, hell let loose in this village, and they said there was a counterattack. I said, well, don't be silly. I've just been down there on a jeep with a ladder. There can't be anybody down there. And with that, of course, the company commander, Major Parker, called for artillery fire on his own position to wipe out the Germans that had come through on a horse and cart.
And I can see this chap now, this German, he's trying to get his horse to come in the road about 30, 40 yards away from us with this cart. So I thought I'd try the paint on the wagon, because there's no ammunition with it about that. But I fired the paint and aimed it off a bit too much for me, but it the horse in the back, blew the back part of the horse clean off, and all the chap was left, all and was brains of the horse with his head and front part.
When we were out down at Vernon, there were some women there. I didn't actually see them.
Were they shaved?
But they did tell me that there were some collaborators, and they shaved their heads.
Gasney. That was in Gasney, where they shaved the blonde.
Only they said they caught 2 or 3 of them there.
That was a place where the priest in charge, he was actually taken away afterwards for being a collaborator with the Germans.
Yes, he was in the monastery, and they discovered all these Luger pistols under his smock.
That's right, yes, under his smock walking around. He was actually a collaborator with the Germans.
At 3:30 on the afternoon of 28th August, the first tanks of 11th Armored Division crossed Vernon Bridge, completed by the Wessex sappers in 36 hours non-stop labor under fire. The Germans vanished up the winding hill into the Vernon forest.
The astonishing drive by our armoured divisions clean through France and Belgium became known later as the Great Swan. But for the first time, 43rd Division was no longer head of the hunt. They were left behind at Vernon with all their vehicles taken to supply this great armoured thrust. And as the names of the liberated towns streamed out on the wireless, Gisors, Amiens, Arras, Cambrai, Lille, Tournai, Brussels, Antwerp, the Wessex men could reflect that it was the 43rd Division who had made the Great Swan possible. Wyvern, an imaginary heraldic beast with the head and 4 feet of an eagle and the wings and tail of a dragon. The battle standard of Wessex since the time of King Arthur 1400 years ago, and the battle sign of the 43rd Wessex Division today.
This is the story of the Wessex Division in World War II, from June 1944 to May 1945. It will be seen sometimes as it actually happened 21 years ago, sometimes in the drawings and sketches of men who were on the spot, and sometimes as the scene appears today, 21 years afterwards.
The story will be told in the words of the men who were there, men from Cornwall and Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, Dorset and Worcestershire, Somerset, Hampshire, men of all arms then and of all walks of life today. A typical territorial infantry division, 17,954 men from the West Country, organized into 3 brigades, each of 3 battalions. September 1944. The 43rd Division had forced the crossing of the Seine at Vernon, and the British tanks poured across the battlefields of the First World War. On September the 1st, the leading troops entered Arras. On September the 2nd, the 11th Armoured Division crossed the Belgian frontier. On September the 3rd, the 5th anniversary of the declaration of war, the Guards Armoured Division liberated Brussels. And 2 days later, the 11th Armoured stormed into Antwerp, an advance of 250 miles in 6 days.
On 16th September, General Horrocks addressed all the officers of 30 Corps, down to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, in the cinema at Bourg-Leopold. The cinema screen was replaced by a gigantic map, and General Horrocks outlined a momentous scheme.
Operation Market Garden. 3 airborne divisions to be dropped at Eindhoven, Nijmegen and Arnhem. The land forces, Guards Armoured Division, 8th Armoured Brigade and 43rd Wessex Division, to drive up a single road and threaten the belly of Germany, the vital industrial region of the Ruhr.
We went to a briefing made by General Horrocks when he informed us that we were to cross the canal at a certain time and drive some 19-20 miles towards Nijmegen. I can remember coming away thinking to myself, well, we're going to put our head in some big news.
Believe you me, it was the roughest journey I ever had in my life. Got to one place, there was a bridge, and we saw lights moving on the bridge. We heard German voices. The commanding officer stopped everything. The Sergeant Heyman of the Assault Pioneers went forward with his platoon, and they found a 500-pound aerial bomb on the bridge. And there was a chap running up the road, and Bert Heyman said, well, if I can get them wires cut before I hear him stop running, I'm all right. And luckily he did.
Eindhoven was reached, Nijmegen was reached. But the road from Nijmegen to Arnhem, where the 1st Airborne Division had been dropped on the 17th of September, ran for 12 miles along a 20-foot high embankment. On the polderland on either side ran anti-tank ditches virtually every 50 yards.
You see, any battalion that was up there could not spread out in advance because the roads were so narrow and with dikes either side. Tanks were useless in that sort of country, you see. Well, it was terrible for troops and just couldn't do anything more.
Oh, it was a flat land you could see for about 1,500 yards. It's just one straight flat.
You could see Arno in the distance from Elst.
All through September the 22nd, the Somersets and Wiltshire fought among the dikes and ditches. Then, in the evening, the DCLI broke through, thrusting 10 miles in half an hour to link up with the Polish Parachute Brigade on the banks of the Nieder Rhine, Driel.
We were lifted by the 47th Dragoon Guards on their tanks, but I was the company carrier. There was a fork in the road. The armour went on and turned left. But in the meantime, before I could get to the fork, 5 Tiger tanks came down. We met them on the roadway. The first 2 tanks pulled in and let us pass. They evidently didn't realise we were English, but the 3rd one stopped right in the middle of the road. We went right under his 88mm gun, practically touching the tank. Tank commander looked over the top, about 9 feet up, looked down on us. put his goggles to one side, said something in German, but I was sitting on top of the carrier with an MG-34, which was a German light machine gun, on my lap. Inadvertently, I suppose I turned it on him and shot him. They opened up with their machine gun, but it was too low to hurt us because it was down in the bottom of the tank. Their 88 was too high, so we just bailed out, got into a ditch, and worked our way back to meet the rest of the battalion. So the company commander said, we can't let him get away with that, so we'll go back and deal with him, because they have to come back the road again. So we went down with the platoon, and 3 pits, and some mines, and laid the trap on the road, and lined the ditches, waiting for them to come back. The first one went over mines, cracked his track or blew it off, stopped in. The second one was dealt with by pits at short range, stopped that one, that was 2. The third one stopped, and I managed to get on top of that one and dropped a grenade right down the turret cover inside. That one stopped. The 4th and 5th tried to turn around and ditch themselves right in the ditch. So we had 5 Tiger tanks all in one little do.
The situation was now confused in the extreme. Across the river, the 1st Airborne Division were cut off and surrounded. 43rd Div was cut off from 30 Corps, and 30 Corps was cut off from 2nd Army.
On 24th September, it was decided to ferry over the Poles in the 4th Dorset in a last attempt to reinforce the beleaguered Airborne Division.
We were under the impression that we were opening up another bridgehead, and that later that night, or the next night, the rest of our brigade, and in fact the rest of our division, would be joining us.
The assault boats for the crossing went astray, and it was not until 1 o'clock in the morning that the leading companies of 4th Dorset embarked, under very heavy fire.
We had great difficulty with the strong current and with the fact that there were not enough paddles to go round in the assault boats, and in fact we got across by using entrenching tools and spades or anything else we could. When we landed, there was about a 50-yard stretch of flat land by the river, and then a cliff or escarpment, which I think was about 150 feet high, quite steep, quite difficult to climb, and the main German position seemed to be on the top of the cliff. My company objective was the top of the cliff. We eventually did get to the top of the cliff. I think there was about 12 of us. That was all left of my company, and that's where we stayed all night. When it was dawn the next morning, things began to look rather unpleasant, and we were being shot at from most sides, so I collected everybody I could find together, and we dug in halfway between the bottom of the cliff and the river. I had about between 30 and 40 people with me. They included 8 or 9 of my own company, odd other members of other companies of the battalion, and quite a number of airborne.
That day, the 25th, the decision was taken to evacuate the 1st Airborne Division from the Arnhem bridgehead.
Well, on the particular night that they started the evacuation of the airborne, it was a terrible night. It was pitch black. It was raining in torrents. I had to report to the CRE on the beaches there, on the home bank, because the REs were getting casualties and they needed us. I got issued with this life jacket, and the first thing, before I put it on, I looked at the life jacket. I turned around to the chap who was issuing them, and I said, I'm certain this is the first time you've been up in the front. So he said, why? I said, well, it's obvious that I'm never going to cross on a night like this. Across here on the evacuation, across on enemy lines, I had a pure white life jacket. I was just like committing suicide.
Meanwhile, the remnants of the 4th Dorset, now less than 40 strong and unable to contact 1st Airborne Division, fought on, unaware of what was happening.
By midnight we could receive no signal, so we moved the few yards down onto the riverbank. We were lucky enough to find one of the assault boats which we used the previous night, which was in reasonable condition, and we pushed all the wounded into this boat. They were sent off first of all with 2 or 3 strong swimmers swimming in the, or pushing the boat literally through the water, because there were no paddles or anything at all. As far as the rest of us were concerned, and I would imagine there were about a dozen or 15 left, there were no other boats, and I said, well, the only thing we do is when you'll just have to swim for it. We discovered then we had 3 non-swimmers. It wasn't until we got back and the other side that we realized that while all this was going on, in fact, the evacuation of the airborne had been taking place.
We picked 3 or 4 airborne chaps up, because we only had a small boat, and brought them back. I'd done that 3 or 4 times. I can remember the bullets from the German sniper that was further up the river, hitting the stones on the home bank and ricocheting off like you sort of hear on a cowboy film.
Situation report to Airborne Corps Headquarters, 26 September. Estimated 1,700 personnel evacuated across the river by 0530 hours. No contact with 4th Dorset, but many Air Div troops report them still fighting.
We saw some 8 or 10 airborne troops which somehow had got out of Arnhem and were marching back down the road. And to this day, I always think of them as zombies. They were like walking dead. Their eyes were staring at their head. They were marching, but they seemed to know no one. They were just marching through sheer courage, it was, sheer courage.
That same day, Hitler personally signed order number 773518, which stated that the enemy in the Arnhem-Nijmegen area will be destroyed by concentric attack. The defense of the island, as it was known, by the 43rd Wessex Division, is a segment of World War II which does not figure in the official histories or the memoirs of generals.
Our orders usually would be gun pits, 40 degrees right, 40 degrees left. And the order came over the tannoy, gun pits, 360 degrees. And upon questioning the fact that this appeared to be a circle, the answer came back, well, we don't know where the enemy is. The supply line had actually been cut, and in that particular gun position, we were rationed to 1 round per gun before any further supplies arrived.
I turned around to my mate, I said, I don't know what you've seen. I said, but the RAF Typhoons, I said, have been rocketing all the way around us.
On the night of 29th, 30th September, the bridges at Nijmegen were attacked with some success by a party of German frogmen.
Oh, it was hand-picked men, 6-footers, 7-foot, big ones. All the frog feet on and all the equipment. And we had a couple of our dispatch riders, Dunnars they call them, and they caught a couple of them, like as they was coming up for some air sort of thing. And these 2 little, if I could see them now, 2 little fellas, they weren't more about 4'6", with the motorbikes, and they wheeled the bikes and brought them back.
We had a FFO, a forward observation officer from the artillery, who got up into the spire of Else Church, and he stopped there until, by sheer exhaustion, we had to go up and get him out, because he'd been banged and banged by shell fire at the church. And we had to get him out and evacuate him with shell shock.
The supply situation broke down, and for a time the troops were fed upon captured German rations.
I think the most horrible thing that happened to the British soldier was having to eat these German rations. But I quite understand why the Germans lost the war if they had to fight on the rations that we had to use up during that campaign.
I can well remember trying to smoke these German cigars, which I don't know whether it's like cabbage leaves. I don't know how many I smoked. I must have had a strong stomach at the time to stand it.
Indeed, at this time, food, ammunition, petrol and equipment all had to come up from the Normandy beaches 450 miles away.
While the banks of the Scheldt estuary were cleared to free the port of Antwerp, the rest of the Allied armies were halted on the frontiers of Germany. This was a period which became known as the Winter War.
Well, the winter of the war, we were in a position called Sandylands, which was outside the Rochefort forest. It wasn't long before each gun had its own courtier stove, and we were then equipped with central heating and pipes, and we carried those stoves with us for the rest of that winter.
The people that really bothered about you, I think, were the Salvation Army. They're always way up, and they always have books, cigarettes, Well, most of the things that you wanted when you were away from home.
I think the first British troops in Germany was two men from the 4th Battalion Somerset Light Infantry who went out on a patrol. And they were the first two chaps to enter Germany of the British Army.
In November, 43rd Division was attached to the 9th United States Army to assist the American drive on Aachen. The immediate objective was the small German town of Geilenkirchen, but the Wessex had the difficult task of capturing the woods and villages which commanded the town. Their names, Niederheide, Hochheide, Boucham, Tripsrath and Dorset Woods, will forever be associated in our minds with mud.
We were then sent off to a wood, which we had 5 report lines in, all named after a cigarette. Woodbine, Players, Kenstiffs, I can't remember the rest, but I know we got as far as Kenstiffs when we had a terrific onslaught of machine fire, and they were very crafty. They let us get out in the middle of the open field and cause us really napping.
Yes, I remember the week we held Dorset Wood. That position there was a very sticky spot. Just at the end of the week, I went back to the first aid with trench feet. My feet went black.
It wasn't unusual at that time for a man to find doesn't pair of wool stockings and wear the lot. That's true.
I know on the road back, probably it was worse in Dorset Wood because we were walking almost to our knees in mud. I remember seeing ambulances bogged down with lads on board. It was really a grim battle, one and all.
The mud at times was very, very considerable. With the churning of the tanks, you would have liquid mud, quite deep liquid mud.
9 days before Christmas, Hitler launched his last all-out gamble, the Ardennes offensive. 8 Panzer and 16 infantry divisions burst through the thinly held American sector and drove for the Meuse River in a desperate attempt to separate the British from the Americans.
Our preparations for Christmas were roughly interrupted when 43rd Division was rushed south to hold the crossings of the Meuse round Liège.
We had the time, if you remember, to halt all American vehicles because the Jerry's had captured so many. And I was on the crossroads with the Major Houston, his name was, and the American vehicle came flying up the road. We halted it. Ascot was. Very husky voice says, "Okay, boss, it's only me." So Major Houston said, "Well, who are you? What are you? German, British, English? What are you?" I said, "These Germans are clever people." He said, "We never know what they would get up to." So a dirty great black face looked around the cab and said, "Yeah, boss, but they ain't that clever."
But on 20th December, a message was received from 30 Corps headquarters, which read, "Christmas will be celebrated on 25th December, which was the most tactful way of telling us that the flap was over and we could relax.
We were in a place called Wyvern in Belgium. Funny enough, the place I come from in England. So and we had an excellent dinner, although it was served in a cow stall.
Our cook come driver was a butcher, and so he's very good at knocking off chickens. Now the 3 of us there plucking chickens merrily away. All of a sudden the one in Jacko's hand jumped up and ran around the run half naked. And of course I looked at Frank, I says, "What's on here?" He said, "Oh, I understand it." He said, "I'm playing a joke on it."
I said, "Could you go out and shoot me one of those pigs because I've pork?" "Yes," he said, "I will." I heard this gun go all bang. Oh, no, he got him, that's good. And I heard another bang, and oh dear. Bang, another one. I thought, Christ, I only want one. And a bang, about he went round through the 6 chambers. And we never had one. So the next best thing out, I said to one of the fellows, I said, "You come from the country?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Could you kill a pig?" "Oh, certainly I can." "With a knife?" "Yes," he said. I pushed him out there with this pig. I gave him the knife. I said, "Go on in." I shut the door. After a while, I thought, well, he might be ready now. I didn't know which was the pig, and I didn't know which was the bloke. He had more blood on him than what was on the pig. That's a fact.
I can well remember having our Christmas dinner that year, 1944, in a village school. I can well remember the quartermaster coming in, asking us how we were getting on, etc. and how we enjoyed our dinner. But I'm afraid that Christmas dinner I didn't enjoy.
The time had now come to assault Hitler's vaunted Siegfried Line. Operation Veritable was the largest offensive undertaken by 21 Army Group in northwest Europe. 13 divisions, 2,000 aircraft, more than 1,000 guns were to blast their way through the Reichswald forest and roll up the triple line of defences around the heavily fortified towns of Cleve, Goch and Emmerich.
The key to the first phase of the operations was a miniature pass outside Cleve, known as the Matterborn Gap. As soon as 15th Scottish Division had seized the gap, 43rd Division was to pass through them and carry the advance onto the high ground north of Goch, the Goch Escarpment.
On the 30 Corps front, a single road led from Nijmegen to Cleve between the Vaal River, which the Germans had flooded, and the tangled mass of the Reichswald forest.
At the outset, a serious misunderstanding between the Army and the Royal Air Force imperiled the whole offensive. General Horrocks had requested that the bombers use only light bombs and incendiaries, but a saturation carpet of high explosive was put down. The resulting craters made Cleve and the approaches to Cleve almost impassable to all transport.
No sooner had the forward troops passed through than the road down through Cranenburg was flooded and all further support on that road was denied. I believe our division got a message, or our brigade got a message, you're on your own, good luck.
We drove in at night, and I remember my own driver was so tired that I said I'd take over from him. And we seemed to be going right over these mounds. You look up and see these terrific mounds, and I couldn't quite make out what they were. To my horror, the RAF crater bomb.
A mistaken report that the 15th Scottish Division were on their objective caused General Horrocks to loose 43rd Division for the breakthrough before the vital road through the Matterborn Gap was clear. The result was the greatest traffic jam of the war and a situation of unparalleled chaos throughout the night.
It was a terrible shambles, Cleve. There was nothing very skillful about it. Well, we were in there. Scores of units were in there. I think the 15th Scottish put in an attack on Cleve, not knowing we were in there. And there were literally hundreds and hundreds of troops all congested up together.
The 5th Wilts were out beyond Cleve, the other side of Cleve at daylight, when German ration trucks started coming into Cleve for their rations.
We came to a straight road, so my battery commander told us to pull into the left there, which we did do. And after a while, a scout car, armoured scout car come along, went by us. All of a sudden he went up in smoke, and a tank went by us, and he got shot up. And another tank come up by the side of us, and he blasted off his 17-pounder, made all my sets jump in the truck. So I got out and told him off about it, and he said, sorry mate, it meant to press my visa. So then he started reversing. I said, here, your track's off. He said, I know. He said, we just been hit. So then the infantry come around the corner, and they're leaning against my truck, firing their rifles off to the woods. So I said to my battery commander, I said, well, who's in front of us? He says, nobody, only the enemy.
When dawn broke wet and cold on the 10th of February, it was a toss-up which of the three major generals involved was the most frustrated. General Barber of the 15th Scottish Division, General Thomas of the 43rd Wessex, or General Fiebig of the German 84th Division. Indeed, the battle was beyond the control of generals and their staffs. It was in the hands of the men fighting amid the rubble and the bomb craters.
And it was on these terms that the Wiltshire, the DCLI and the Somersets battered their way through the ruins, out into the woods towards Goch.
On the 8th day of Operation Veritable, 214 Brigade of the Wessex Division broke out of the narrow salient below Cleve Forest. In a brilliant night attack, 4th Somerset Light Infantry gained a foothold on the dreaded Goch escarpment. A captured German major that night complained that in 6 years of war he had never known the British attack by night. The next day, the 7th Somerset and the 1st Worcester pressed home the advantage, and Goch, northern pivot of the Siegfried line, was doomed.
In 10 days' desperate fighting, the 43rd Wessex Division, with open flanks in unspeakable conditions, advanced 10,000 yards down the Siegfried line and took 2,400 prisoners.
Though the Battle of the Rhineland was not yet over, it was unmistakably won. And by the 10th of March 1945, no German forces remained west of the Rhine. The capture of Cleve and the Goch escarpment had turned the Siegfried line from the north. Goch itself fell on the 21st of February, and in the next 10 days, Kalkar, Udem, and a dozen fortified villages were stormed one by one in the rain and the mud. On the 8th of March 1945, 129 Brigade of the Wessex Division advanced against the last German strongholds west of the Rhine, and throughout the 8th and 9th, the 4th Somerset and the 4th Wiltshire beat down the final opposition around Xanten, and by the 10th of March, no German forces remained west of the River Rhine. 21 Army Group launched its assault over the river on the night of the 23rd to the 24th of March. 4 crossings were forced between Ries and Wesel, and a few hours later, 40,000 airborne troops were landed in broad daylight from an air armada of over 4,000 Dakotas, Stirlings, Halifax, Lancaster, Fortresses and Liberators, protected by 1,200 fighter aircraft. This was the beginning of the end.
The 43rd Division crossed the Rhine on the 26th and 27th March, passed through the Highland Division, and after some stiff initial opposition, headed the great surge across the last piece of unliberated Holland, on into the heart of Germany.
Hengelo, the last Dutch town to be freed, welcomed the Dorsets with open arms and granted the regiment the charter or freedom of the borough. Then the Wessex Division pressed on into Germany. The front collapsed. In fact, there was no front at all. Neither side knew where the other was. And round every next corner you might find column after column of dispirited, unarmed German soldiers trudging into the very same prison camps from which our own liberated prisoners of war were streaming. Or one might be halted by a chaos of German civilian refugees, or swamped by hysterical foreign slave labor wandering back on their own to every country in Europe. Or one might be greeted by a show of white flags hung from every window, or a burst of fire from some last fanatical, isolated point of resistance.
I knew we were passing Germans coming back, nobody bothering about them, just couldn't bother to take them prisoner. Everything was sort of chaotic then.
And then, of course, we passed thousands of refugees. Very pitiful looking specimens they were too. And one could not but feel sorry for them, with their carts and bits of baggage, clothes that they had there, wandering aimlessly along the roads.
We finished the war north of Bremen. We, with the 52nd Division, the 43rd took part in the capture of Bremen. The 52nd went actually straight at it, and we were really covering their right flank.
What we were actually doing in Bremen was going through the park, and they come across some big general. We knew it was a big general. There was loads of snipers about. Nobody, you know, you couldn't get down to it and fight them. Loads of snipers about, and that's about all it was.
The 4th Somerset Light Infantry were able to capture the commander of the garrison, whose name was General Sieber. But he arrived at midnight and was the worse for wear in more senses than one. I think he had a good deal of whiskey.
I had Lee coming to me when they were preparing the mounted attack on Brain. And I said to my chaps when I came away, well, so long, lads, I can't do any more fighting. That's the end of the war. And I was right.
At 8 p.m. on Friday, 4th May, Major General Thomas arrived at 214 Brigade headquarters to issue his orders in my caravan for the capture of Bremerhaven the next day. At 8:40, our conference was interrupted by my brigade major. "Sir," said Major Chalmers, "the BBC have just announced the unconditional surrender of the German forces opposing Field Marshal Montgomery in Northwest Europe." General Thomas answered coldly, "I take my orders from the Corps Commander, not the BBC." The brigade major withdrew. 5 minutes later, he again interrupted the briefing. This time he handed over a signal message. "Personal to you, sir, from the Corps Commander, timed 21:15 hours. "Read it," said the general. "Germans surrender unconditionally at 18:20 hours. Stop. Hostilities on all Second Army front will cease 0800 hours tomorrow, 5th May, 45. Stop. No, repeat, no advance beyond present front line without further orders from me." Without comment, General Thomas pulled the canvas cover over his map and climbed down from the caravan. We walked in silence to his armored car 20 yards away. Then, as he was about to climb in, he said, "The troops have done us damn well."
I think people were terribly tired. Oh, yeah. Completely exhausted. And it was sort of relief, rather, thank God for that.
Yes.
So you eventually had to pull yourself together and,
Yes.
and start on. It took a lot to acclimatise oneself, because I couldn't understand why you couldn't carry on firing when you had all this ammunition knocking around. It's somewhat or other, but it was very good to think it was over.
I think we were still walking along with our head half cocked, looking over our shoulder for the next man that would probably...
Well, the anti-climate.
Anti-climate, yeah.
I, with 3 other men, had bedded down for the night, and someone came along and said, "The war is over." So everybody said, "Oh, what about it? Turn over. I want to go off to sleep."
I just couldn't be joyful. In fact, I think the battalion only celebrated. They did let off some flares and things like that, just to celebrate, but I think most men were just glad that it was finished. I don't think anyone could really celebrate. Just the fact that it was over.
I celebrated that night.
Well, you might have had a drop. I know 1 or 2 did, but
I was
not.
back in England in the hospital.
All I could celebrate with was a cup of tea. All the others had was rum, which I couldn't stomach.
One of relief, more than anything, of thankfulness to personally being able to survive. I think one thinks of all the friends who had gone. But I think it was a feeling of relief after so long to feel that the fighting had ended.
On 10th May 1945, Major General G.I. Thomas, who had trained and led the 43rd Wessex Division for 3 years, received a letter from Lieutenant General Sir Brian Horrocks, under whom, in 30 Corps, the division had done most of its fighting.
When I look back on the past 10 months and think of the many difficult battles that have been fought by 30 Corps, I always find that the Wyvern has played a prominent part in them all. The capture of Mount Pinson, the crossing of the Seine, the fighting round Nijmegen, the battles at Geilenkirchen, Operation Veritable, and the final advance into Germany. It's a formidable list. If I was asked to pick out one for special mention, I would select that attack on the 16th of February 1945, when the Wessex Division carried out a brilliant 8,000 yards advance down to the escarpment overlooking the fortified town of Gosch. This was the turning point in the Battle of the Reichswald. I doubt whether any other division has had so much hard fighting or has been so uniformly successful.
In 10 months, 1 week and 5 days, the 43rd Wessex Division had advanced just short of 1,000 miles.